BACP overall, the Department of Business Affairs and Consumer Protection at the city for being such a great partner in everything that we've attempted to do in order to help as many small businesses as we can in this tough time. Let me, I think more importantly, say thank you to all of you who are participating here this morning, particularly the small business owners who are doing everything that you can in order to retain the employees that you have, that serve the customers that are still seeking what you're providing, and working with your suppliers and all of the rest, because we all know this is an incredibly difficult moment, clearly, to run a small business, and yet a huge number of the small businesses that we serve are persevering and just figuring it out on a day-to-day basis. So we're just grateful to be able to help as many people as possible. So thank you for that, and thank you for your time this morning. We'll try to use it well. So I'm going to briefly just describe who Accion is, what we do, and then from there, we're going to get right into the meat of it. So Accion helps neighborhood entrepreneurs grow by providing all three of the capital and the coaching and the connections that small business owners need. We focus throughout Illinois and Indiana, but have a very particular interest in the south and west sides of Chicago that are traditionally underserved. We are based at the Hatchery, which is the food and beverage incubator that we are a 50-50 joint venture partner of and owner of, and therefore we have an interest as a tenant and as an owner in that space. That is in the heart of East Garfield Park at Lake and Kedzie. Please come see us once we return to something closer to normal. But our focus in this crisis has been different. And so we're going to talk today about how that looks and the things that we can do differently in order to be helpful here, both for capital and for coaching. So the agenda for the next 15 minutes is to walk through the emergency capital that is available for small businesses to be evaluating still 2 months into this crisis. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the primary questions that we recommend that small businesses be asking themselves, and which we are, as coaches, helping small businesses to help answer for their businesses. And so we're going to spend time on both of these and then stop and then spend the rest of the time just answering your questions, because we want to make sure we use your time as effectively as we can. So let's start with capital, and then we'll move to coaching after that. So there's a long list, confusing list, I think, of emergency capital options that have been launched over the course of time. The list you see here is, I hope, both impressive and exhausting, I think, for small businesses to try to figure out, because just speaking specifically for Accion, where we've been participating in each and every one of these initiatives, we're seeking to provide over $50 million in loans and grants to small business owners between March 15th and June 15th to over 3,000 small businesses on an average of about $17,000 to $18,000 per business. We'll help through coaching another 5,000 small businesses in a variety of different ways. And yet we know it's not nearly enough. It's just not enough. And so we have to continually be thinking creatively about how can we do more. So what I've listed here is particularly highlighting the items which are still available for emergency capital purposes. And we're going to talk about those in a little bit more detail. So 2 items for the federal level, 2 for state. We're going to talk about the county in just a moment, 2 for the city of Chicago, and then Accion specifically, we'll round out the discussion on capital with that. So let's start with the federal SBA capital program, which by far has received the most attention. And so my suspicion is that many of you, if not most of you, have some familiarity with the Paycheck Protection Program. Importantly, I want to highlight 2 things right away. One is that for anyone who is running a small business within the city of Chicago, or frankly anywhere, in Illinois and Indiana, which is the footprint that Accion serves, who has not received a Paycheck Protection Program loan yet, we highly encourage you to apply for one through us and do it today, because the time is still ticking on the availability of funds for this program nationally, and we're seeking to provide as many of those dollars to Chicago and Illinois specifically businesses as we possibly can. And so we have availability of funds and want to get those dollars out, but we can only do so up until the day that the reservations are complete on the SBA nationwide registry. And at that point, then obviously the program will cease, just like it had done previously, and then it was restarted for the second round of funds. So that's the first of the messages I want to convey here. The details for how to do so, you'll see a lot of that here in front of you. I won't go through this in detail, but we're happy to talk about that in more detail, either with you individually or specifically in the Q&A here. But secondly, for those who have accessed the PPP program and are getting close to having the calendar be such that it's 8 weeks later from the date at which you received those funds, you will now be in a position to be seeking the forgiveness portion of some or all of this program. And so we want to be helping you with that too. So you see lots of details about the program. I'll leave the application link for you so you can very directly find how to apply through us if you haven't yet. But let me just spend a little bit of time on how this forgiveness portion of the program, which is the most important part of it, will work in practice. So just, 3 days ago, I think it was, a few days ago, the SBA and Treasury released the calculation for how those who are seeking forgiveness under the Paycheck Protection Program should do that math in order to then be able to get the loan, which otherwise they have to repay, forgiven, so that you don't, at least in part, if not in whole. So what you see in front of you is an 11-line schedule, which for those of you who don't want to do all of this math in your head on a Friday morning, we will not go through in detail. But just know that we're here to help you with that as you're ready to do so if you're in that position and you already have a PPP loan and now you're seeking forgiveness. Most importantly, I'll just highlight a couple of the key provisions in the way that this program works so that then you're internalizing that as you go. So just as an aside, thank you, Jackie, for putting the URL for how to directly apply for this PPP into the Q&A. So feel free, please, to use that link to start a PPP application if you have not received one yet. But again, for those who have, most importantly, the encouragement from the federal government in this program is to use the funds that you can access through the PPP in order to invest those funds in payroll, in paying people, keeping them on staff, or rehiring them, as the case may be. There's a 75% of use of funds threshold that the federal government has established in order to qualify for forgiveness for some of this loan. Now, to be clear, you can use the money on all of the eligible expenses, which is inclusive of all compensation costs, payroll, of course, plus the occupancy costs, which you may have, which could be in the form of rent, mortgage interest, utilities. And then as you look at the specific of the details of the program, there are some very specific things that allow you to invest the funds beyond that, but those are the most important items, which are highlighted. I think if you spend 3/4 of those funds on compensation costs, then you're eligible for this forgiveness math. If you don't, that's still okay. It just it continues to be, as you would have signed for to the closing table, a loan which has a 1% interest rate and a 2-year term. So again, that's still attractive capital completely compared to normal times, obviously. That's a great interest rate, even though the term is much shorter than I think it should be, ideally would be. But it's even better capital if it's free. So we'll work with you through math like what you see on the screen here in order to calculate and seek that forgiveness if you've applied through us. If you have applied through a bank and succeeded in securing a PPP loan, that'll be the institution that, again, you'll be working with in order to seek the forgiveness. So just know that this is the math that all institutions are using, and all of this, presumably in all institutions, I think, will be done online. And so you'll be able to just populate a web browser full of fields that are like this in order to do the calculation. So there's tons of details behind this, but I wanted to at least highlight both the availability of these PPP loans still to apply now, and for those who have already applied and are now thinking about how to use those funds and seek forgiveness later, just structurally how you will do that. And it's, again, based on what you see here. It's payroll and non-payroll costs. It's the adjustments that you have to make because there's a limitation on not having anybody who makes over $100,000 have that additional compensation be included. And then you calculate the potential forgiveness amount and then the actual forgiveness amount. So again, we'll work with you on that, and we can talk more about that in detail in the Q&A if you'd like. Also available through the federal government is the second of the two emergency loans, and that is the economic injury disaster loans, the EIDLs. This is still currently open just for agricultural businesses, and so I suspect that very few of the people on this webinar would be eligible to now apply for this. I suspect, though, that many of you have already applied for this and may have questions about how the treatment of those funds should look as a matter of accounting and taxation and the rest, so we can talk about those in the Q&A as you would like. And that's particularly true given the fact that there was a provision that was available through the EIDLs through which you could apply for a $10,000 advance, which was essentially a grant. And if you're able to secure those funds, then there are interesting questions that are in many cases now answered and in many cases still not answered about what you can do with those funds, how you should treat those funds on your profit and loss statement and the rest. So again, happy to talk about those in detail as we go. But just suffice to say that it's slightly open just for agriculture interests, and this is the second of the two emergency programs from the federal government that is still running. So the other emergency capital program, which is not launched yet, but I think will launch soon, is specifically for suburban Cook County businesses, where information, I believe, will be out as early as next week about how to apply for those loans. Those will be 0% loans and focused on a particular amount for either employers or independent contractors at $20,000 and $10,000 respectively. And you see in front of you some of the basic details which the county has already published. We're working with lots of people at the county to get the details finalized and then promulgated immediately thereafter. So more to come on that, but it is coming soon from the county for those who are operating as your primary business address in suburban Cook. So what I haven't done here is highlighted the state and city emergency programs, which are certainly still running. We are funding more and more loans every single day through both of those emergency loan programs. The application window, however, is closed because we have such an oversubscription of the dollars that are available compared to the applications we've already received. And so therefore, I'm happy to take questions about the city and state programs that you would have seen in this initial list that we had here, but won't dwell on those here. Same thing for the two grant programs that we helped the city and state run because those grant dollars are already expended. So to finish the discussion about capital, when we get through the teeth of the crisis and we're moving to the long and uncertain recovery, Accion will then go back to the more traditional type of lending, which we have long done, and focus on providing lines of credit or term loans for businesses who are still looking for capital they have not yet received and still need. And so we'll be looking to do that in the early portion of Q3, so consider that to be July. And that's because we're focusing now first and foremost on getting as much of that very attractively priced emergency capital out as much as we can until those dollars are out in full. And then we will turn to just continuing our work, but doing so using more normal terms and rates. So you see some of the details of that here. That is in the near future, but not immediate because of the emergency work we still need to do. So that's a very quick race through a number of different concepts that are specific to the emergency capital that's been available. I do want to make sure that we can come back to specific questions, specifically with respect to the Paycheck Protection Program. But we're going to speak just a few minutes before we do that to the, before I do that, I want to show just a very quick side-by-side of city, state, and federal emergency loan programs, specifically because there may be some of you who are trying to decide which of these to take in order to make sure that you're optimizing your cash flows. And so what you see before you is just a very simplistic side-by-side of the basics and then the details of how these three programs compare to each other. And again, this is only specifically for those who are in multiple queues and are trying to figure out when your time comes up, if you've already, say, received a PPP loan, should you then also take a city loan or a state loan? Just to be crystal clear on this point, you absolutely can. There's no prohibition whatsoever from taking more than one loan out. But as always, you need to manage debt carefully and think about cash flow now plus interest payments later, and just be prudent about the choices you make about which options to take. And so you'll see here that there are some very specific similarities between the programs, but there are some very important differences which we can again highlight once we get to the Q&A if there are people who are participating in the webinar today who are in that position where they're trying to make choices between one or many of these particular emergency capital programs that may be available to you. Okay, so to spend a few minutes then before we go to the question and answer, talking about what are the types of questions which small business owners should be thinking about. So each of you who are running a small business has already been thinking about all of these things, I think, in some form or another. What I've tried to do here simply is to take in revenue, expenses, assets, and liabilities groupings. Tried to put some specificity for some of those important questions to be answering, knowing that you're going to have many, many, many others on top of these that for your business you'll be working with. So you have our commitment at Accion to provide the one-on-one coaching that you may need if you're interested in it. And so I'm going to ask Jackie to put the link to our coaching calendar also in the chat so that therefore we're able to be sure to have you access that free one-on-one coaching if you'd like. But let me just highlight a few things that we're recommending that small business owners be thinking about as we seek to have as many small business owners recover from this pandemic as we can. So first and foremost, the toughest question by far, I think, is who are your customers and how is that different than it was in normal times? Because as the economic dynamic changes around us, so too will people's spending patterns. And it may well be that for some of the businesses who are participating here today, you have a small number of, say, relatively large customers, and you've already gotten commitments from them that they're going to keep purchasing from you. Great, perfect. There may be others where you have not that, but rather you have just a large number of small dollar customers, small proportional customers to your overall revenues. And in that case, it's harder to get those specific commitments. And therefore, I think that's where a lot more creativity is going to have to be put in place here about which customers can you continue to secure and serve in a way that will generate the revenues that you need to be profitable. And then you have to think about exactly how to do that, right? So a combination of identifying very specifically who those customers are and what strategies you will use to acquire and retain those customers sits at the top of every small business's list of things to evaluate, I think, as it stands at the moment. There are questions about pricing that I think each small business has to think about where in an environment like this, discounting is, I think, quite appropriate in many cases. It's certainly tempting, but it also hurts, right? Those discounts hurt the bottom line. And so there are going to be business-specific issues to work through on that basis, which we're happy to work with you on, but I know you're already thinking about. Let's turn to expenses. So again, same thing, but on the flip side, if you have a few key suppliers where you already have had conversations about continuing that supplying relationship, then I think you're in good shape, potentially as long as those relationships are strong. If on the other hand, you've got a diverse set of suppliers where your supply chain requires you to be nimble across a number of different partners, then those conversations I think are equally important, if not more so. And you have to be nimble about which to continue to work with and which you're not quite sure are going to survive themselves and therefore you need to move on from. So ideally you keep the exact same set that you're comfortable with and keep working with them. And hopefully in many cases that's going to be possible. And if so, great. Same types of questions on staff, right? You just think about your biggest costs. You've got your cost of goods sold. You've got your compensation costs for staff. And you think about that carefully, as I know you all do on a daily basis already. And then the occupancy cost is usually the next big set of operating expenses to evaluate. And so I know everyone is thinking about how to potentially lower those occupancy costs in order to reduce expenses overall. So let's then briefly talk about just how we use each business's assets and minimize the liabilities you've got too. So primary asset you have is cash, right? And so I think just being clear about how many days of operating cash are available to you, pure liquidity in order to cover immediate costs. Every business thinks about this every single day. And so just being tight on that is even more important than it usually is, and it's always important. And so therefore having tight strategies on how to manage that cash is going to be crucial. Again, always is, but even more important now. But then maybe you might be a business who has other assets that you can creatively leverage on your balance sheet. And so that would depend on the size of your business and what kind of assets you have. But again, I'm happy to talk in detail with you on a one-on-one basis through our coaching if that makes sense. And then thinking about your liabilities, I think these are tough conversations, right? Where you've got contracts, you have relationships, and I think thinking carefully and creatively about which of those contracts you're able to amend in partnership with the other party in the contract is something that I think every business owner is thinking about now and needs to continue to. And that takes real, I think, tight strategic thought, good relationship management, and ideally firmness on your behalf in just being clear about what you're able to pay and what you intend to continue and want to continue to pay in order to help both sides of the relationship versus those that you can't. So I think these are all interim questions that feed into longer term questions, which I think each business owner is already thinking about, but thinking about where you're going to be at the end of 2020 and then backing into that from where you are right now in the middle of May will help, I think, to put context to the way in which you're making decisions now and how those decisions are going to impact what you're coming up with in the future. So I'm going to stop there so we get detailed into the questions which you have, again, either specifically to the capital options that are available and some of the technical issues that are that we're all grappling with, some of those, or some of those coaching questions are important. But here's a list of the ways in which to keep in contact with us. Again, in the chat, you will see 2 specific links, one to apply for PPPs, the other to make a reservation for one-on-one coaching. And so please use that. So with that, I'd like to just open for questions and spend the remaining half an hour on that. So can I ask for our moderators to help with that, please? And I'll do the best I can to answer the questions that the group poses through the chat.
Thanks so much. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jackie. It's Elisa back on. One question was, how quickly do you have to use the small business emergency loan?
Good point. So there are a couple things to think about here. First of all, I think it's important to note that the different programs have different time frames. So could maybe the person who asked that question just be specific about which program they're speaking about so that I can give good information on that?
Absolutely. So we'll see if that person responds. Emergency disaster loan.
Okay. So the emergency injury disaster loan has the longest time frame for repayments amongst all of the programs that have been launched in this kind of emergency basis. So just for clarity, in order to provide a bit of context in each one of these answers for those who maybe aren't quite as well-versed in a particular program we might be speaking about. So briefly, this is, again, this is the SBA-specific EIDL program, which has a potentially very long term. It was publicized to be up to 30 years, but the honest truth is that very, very few small business owners are able to secure that through the SBA. The longest term that I've heard of is 10 years in this sort of emergency time. But this is the one program amongst all of the emergency programs that we listed here originally, which is only available directly through the SBA. So the application itself goes through the Small Business Administration. All of the rest of these programs you can apply through a lender like Accion or through, in many cases, through a traditional bank. So specifically then for the use of the funds for EIDL. The use of the funds and the repayment period are not the same. And so therefore, I think there are two ways to think about how fast you need to use funds and on what basis for EIDL. One is that advance, that $10,000 advance amount of money which you do not have to repay. The other is the portion of the outstanding loan that you need to then use the funds for. So there's conflicting guidance on this. Unfortunately, there's going to be a recurring theme here where I'm going to do the best I can to be clear about what we know, but not overstate what we don't know. So the conflicting guidance is that as long as this, we understand it, as long as you're using your EIDL dollars in a way that has different uses of those funds than a PPP loan that you might have also secured, in that circumstance, then you should be able to use the funds over the period of time for your repayment, right? So I say that in tentative terms because there's also been guidance which the SBA has provided informally, that I've at least heard, where there is an encouragement to use the money far more quickly in order to then essentially boost the economy, which we all care about here in this situation in which unemployment is cratering and economic activity is cratering. So I think this is one of the many points, which I think we're going to talk about in the next half hour, in which I would love to give you very specific details on exactly how we should all proceed based on specific guidance that we have, but the guidance itself isn't clear enough for us to do so. So one thing I will commit to do for this group is to, a week from now, continue to search for the additional guidance that continually comes out, and then just send a note through BACP for how to provide even more detail to this group that participated based on what we know a week from now that we don't know now. This is one of those questions which we'll continue to seek guidance on, specifically for the speed and use of funds for both the advance for the EIDL and the loan itself. So more to come on that, but that's what we know so far, which is not as much as we'd like.
Wonderful. We have a lot of questions coming in. Another question is, can you explain when the timeline starts of when the funds need to be used? If you receive the funds on 5/15, money has to be spent between 5/15 until 6/30. So a lot of, I guess, timeline questions.
Yeah, and again, these are going to be very program specific. So I'm just going to assume for the minute for this question that that is a question specifically to the Paycheck Protection Program. If that turns out to be not true, then I can answer it again for whatever program the question was asking about. But for the Paycheck Protection Program, the way that the time window is structured is that the day that you receive your disbursement of funds, that begins an 8-week clock. And so there is not a hard and fast June 30th deadline, which has been very confusing, in order to use the funds and then seek their forgiveness. That is not the case. If you receive your loan on, say, May 15th, you have 8 weeks from May 15th in order to use and then substantiate use of those funds in order to then seek forgiveness for that portion, some, or all of that loan. So it's important to make, I think, a couple clarifications here. One is that remember that at the closing table on May 15th, say, you probably would have closed on this, say, May 13th and received your funds on maybe May 15th, something like that. You signed up for a 2-year loan at 1% interest. You may remember that there was no discussion at that closing table of forgiveness windows and timeframes and all of that, because all of that comes later. So you can use your funds for the next 2 years. It's only if you want to get a portion or all of your loan forgiven that you have a very fixed window to use the funds and then report on the use of those funds. So presumably, most people would like to have this loan turn into a grant. Okay, so therefore you're going to be trying to be very careful using your funds in a way that maximizes the forgiveness of those funds. And therefore you do absolutely want to pay close attention to this 8-week window, which in this case would be roughly July 15th, not exactly, but roughly. And therefore you need the documentation to substantiate that use of funds. But that is not a hard and fast requirement for using all the funds if you're not going to seek forgiveness of all of those funds. So that's each business owner's decision to make about the degree to which you want to seek that forgiveness and how fast you want to use those funds.
Great. Is the PPP ideal for owners who don't have employees? I've heard that some criteria have changed, that solopreneurs should apply.
Yeah. In a sea of confusion, this might be the single most confusing thing that we've all been dealing with. So again, quick context. The program from the SBA launched on April 3rd, but only businesses with employees could apply on April 3rd. The program opened up to sole proprietors and independent contractors on April 10th. And so in between April 3rd and April 10th, additional guidance came out about exactly how individuals who don't have employees should be applying and under what criteria and how this is all going to work. And then an avalanche of additional clarifying questions were sent to Treasury and SBA in order to help us all, and I mean nationwide all, figure out the specific technical details that are crucial for us to provide good advice and for people to apply in a way that would maximize the benefits to them. So the direct way to answer your question is, it absolutely is beneficial to you if you're going to be able to use the funds in a way that is helpful for you to grow your business, full stop. So that could be just getting access to capital at 1% that you can repay over 2 years, even if you're not able to seek forgiveness for any of the portion of your funds. Or even better, if you're able to substantiate payroll spend in an 8-week period after the funds have been dispersed to you, clearly that's very valuable too, and even more so. So initially, there were lots of questions about, well, does this even make sense for somebody who doesn't have employees, and therefore don't have significant compensation? The answer to the question is, generally for most small businesses, it does make sense. The final complication, though, and this I think is where it gets very, very tricky and is very specific to each individual circumstance, is how a sole proprietor or an independent contractor who would apply for PPP would evaluate whether that is the best approach to take in this emergency situation, or alternatively, whether using the unemployment system and unemployment insurance would be the best option for them to take, given the fact that in the very same bill that established the Paycheck Protection Program, the CARES Act, that bill also enhanced unemployment insurance. So I've run through with small business owners a number of different scenarios in which, depending on the specifics of their circumstances, it was more beneficial for them in some cases to apply for and secure a Paycheck Protection Program loan, and in other cases it was more beneficial for them to just seek unemployment insurance. And so it really does depend on which expenses you intend to incur over the next 8 weeks. And if you really do have significant expenses that you're going to be essentially being able to get granted to you, then it does make sense, I think, for a PPP loan. And if instead you're just seeking to basically get as much cash in as possible to save that money and not spend it, so that then you're able to continue on when your customers return, in that circumstance, unemployment insurance is generally better. But again, it depends on specific circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I received a $7,000 EIDL advance, but received a denial for the actual funding. Can you cover the details of this versus the actual EIDL loan?
Yes. So if you received a $7,000 advance/grant, you do not have to repay that simply because you were not able to secure the loan thereafter. That's yours to keep. So that's the good news. The less good news, of course, is that you weren't able to get the EIDL loan itself. And obviously the circumstances to you are specific to that. So there's been a lot of confusion about, well, if this is an advance, because that's the SBA's term, does that mean that I have to pay back that advance if I didn't get the loan, presumably to which the advance was applicable? The answer is no. Like, that advance is yours. You do not have to repay it simply because you didn't get the loan.
Okay. I hate to backtrack, but when we were talking about the PPP for owners who don't have employees, the person chimed in. I should clarify my question. I was a startup solopreneur in 2019, so I don't have a payroll history. So does that change any part of your response to her?
I think in that case, given that there are going to be relatively little in expense that you're able to get forgiven through the PPP program, simply because your baseline is zero. Unless you're going to spend a significant amount of money on compensation expenses now, then I think unemployment insurance in that case is probably the right way to go. And again, I hesitate to say that with such a definition, simply because all of the circumstances are unique and really matter here. I don't sound like a lawyer, God help me, but it's actually true in this case. No offense to the lawyers on the call, by the way. So I think in that case, it's probably right that unemployment insurance would be more beneficial, but it is going to be issue specific, I think.
Are there any programs that will target specifically accumulating outstanding monthly rent payments for small businesses as a result of the health crisis?
Something that I personally have advocated for. in an effort to think about both sides of the P&L. The answer at the moment is no. But let me talk about the way that ideally this would work, and to be crystal clear, this is not in place at the moment. At the same time, we're trying to provide more cash on the revenue side, where you're able to generate more customer receipts and think through the most creative ways to sell more stuff by having the cash available through these emergency programs to make investments in seeking those customers and those clients. Ideally, what we would also be doing is reducing expenses on the other side in order to reduce either rent or mortgage interest, depending on your occupancy circumstance. So I'll just provide the same guidance that we would provide on an individual basis to any small business owner. The best thing we would recommend to do is to talk to, in the case of a renter, your landlord, and just explain your circumstance. And it's, I think, nearly uniformly true that in this environment, landlords do not want to lose previously good paying tenants and then get nothing coming back in the form of tenant revenue because a small business had to close because it couldn't pay their bills. So instead, there is at least going to be some openness, I think, in many cases, for just coming up with a modified plan in which the rent would look different. But it really does require, I think, open and honest communication with your landlord. And therefore, this is, I think, a relationship-driven discussion where transparency will help. I think it's just being honest about what you're able to do and what you want to do in order to retain that relationship. And then it's going to depend upon the nature of that relationship and what both parties decide that they can do as to what ends up being done with respect to that rent. So that is today's answer. Ideally, we'd have a policy prescription that would be beyond that, in which there'd be benefits that the city or state or federal government would cover in order to help full rent payments, but we don't have that at the moment.
That's actually a great response, talking about just the relationship building and being open and honest and transparent with your landlord. Absolutely. A little sidebar comment. We have the presentation deck available. We will be sharing this entire webinar presentation on the BACP YouTube page. If you go to youtube.com, just search for Chicago BACP. And I will put that information in the chat box. 1 second. Dear Brad, sounds like an open letter in a newspaper. Dear Brad, in the last seminar, you gave a very good overview of the money shortfall and what was needed to fund existing emergency loan approvals. I believe there are 170 of us. Would you kindly provide an update on your progress with the numbers, if possible, with timelines?
I believe that this questioner is referring to a webinar that we did specifically for the state emergency loan program. And so, again, for context, this is one of the many programs that we listed here. This is State of Illinois Small Business Emergency Loan Fund. So our goal at Accion as one of the lead partners in that program is to fund $10 million of emergency loans in partnership with the state and in partnership with financial institutions who are lending to Accion the loan capital that we need to in turn lend that money directly to the small business owners who have applied for it. So part of my job, the reason why I don't sleep very much, is to get that $10 million borrowed through Accion and distributed. So just today, we're going to be funding the next $1.7 million in those loan applications, which have already been closed or are closing as we stand at the moment. And therefore, we are up to a little shy of $7 million in overall fundings that will have completed as of end of day today, $6.8 million to be precise. That leaves us with $3.2 million in additional loans, which we need to continue to seek the funds for in order to then close and fund those loans. And I have a very clear view for where those additional $3.2 million will come from. I'm in 5 different underwriting queues with financial institutions right now in order to secure those funds and get those funds then immediately deployed to the small business owners who are looking for it. So let's say it this way. I think for all of you who have been super frustrated by the endless queues and waiting in trying to figure how to get city or state or federal loan applications processed, I feel you, because I'm in more queues than that even to get Axion's loans approved so that we in turn can make the loans that we want to make through all these programs. And it's not an equivalent circumstance by any means, but just know that we will not stop until we have every single one of those $10 million funded in the state program. And again, 1.7 million of which is going to get funded today. And I just was able to secure those instructions to our team about 3 minutes before this webinar started. So all those small business owners will be notified today that the fundings are on their way. And then beyond that, it's still $3.2 million to go, and we won't sleep until we get it done.
Awesome. When I applied for EIDL, I was listed as a sole proprietor. They are currently processing my request. I want to switch to an LLC this month. Should I wait until my loan/paperwork with SBA is completed?
Yes.
The response, love it, yes.
Only because I think just given the enormity of the queue that the SBA is processing, I'll just humbly suggest that anything that you do to complicate that process is probably not in your best interests. And so I think finish one legal transaction and then move on to the next would be my recommendation.
Good morning. I've been attempting to apply for a number of the loans which were made available. Unfortunately, being a new business, I've not been able to get any of them. Will your office be able to look at what I've accomplished since startup and guide me through the process?
Yes, absolutely. So 2 ways. One is that if you're looking for just pure coaching to think through what comes next, use the link that was in the chat a little bit earlier to just get onto our coaching calendar, and we'll help you on a one-on-one basis. Second, if your business was begun before February 15th and therefore is just barely pre-crisis, you are absolutely eligible to apply for a Paycheck Protection Program loan through us. And again, we'll help you with that on a one-on-one basis and use the link that is also in the chat in order to do that. That is, the Paycheck Protection Program loan is really the only loan of which I'm aware on an emergency basis where being a startup is okay. All of the rest of them are looking for more established businesses purely because the money is so scarce relative to the demand for it that we're trying to think through, when I say we now, I mean policymakers, we're trying to think through how to maximize the likelihood that the dollars will be spent on businesses that will continue because they have track records. PPP is not like that in a good way. And so I think certainly apply for that, and then the degree to which you'll be able to get forgivable, get a portion of that be forgiven, again, is going to be dependent on your unique circumstances. If you're a brand new business, you likely maybe don't have a lot of payroll expenses, and therefore this will turn into a loan and not necessarily a grant. But again, 1% dollars is not bad. So I'll encourage you to apply for that as long as you have can substantiate that your business began before February 15th.
And Jackie from Accion will put up the coaching link in the chat box so you guys can jot that down.
Yeah, she did. I saw that a little earlier. Yeah.
Perfect. We have still a good amount of questions, and I promise we will get through your questions. I see some people just asking, please make sure my name gets answered. We will go through them, I promise you.
Yeah, and I'll add to that that I'm quite happy to just look at all of the remaining questions that we run out of time to answer and just provide a written answer if I can.
Okay. And we still definitely have some time, and while we have people on this webinar, we can do a couple more for sure. I used an average of my income from 2019 for purposes of PPP loan calculation. My business is somewhat seasonal in a sense that I make more money late spring to mid-fall than the rest of the year. So right now, I would be making more money now than the average that I used. I'm an S-Corp with myself as a single employee. Can I pay myself the entire amount as a payroll over the 8-week period? Thank you. I'm guessing this is for the PPP.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So there, again, are very specific rules that are in play here, which have been fairly clearly articulated, I think, in this case, relative to some of the other ambiguities that we're dealing with. So the first thing to think about is that there is the $100,000 limitation, just to keep in mind, on any individual who would have their costs be covered, but set that aside. I think otherwise, the degree to which you're, as an S corp, paying yourself is going to go directly into this, this calculation here, where provided that you also had essentially the same FTE level, say 1, in 2019, and therefore that baseline number is the same as your new number, that means that you're able to have this line 7 in here, the Fte Reduction Quotient. I mean, honestly, like only the government come up with a phrase like that, in which you're going to be able to claim a significant proportion of those dollars in your forgiveness, I think. So I think, again, the specifics will matter here. We're quite happy to work with you on that, but you really should be able to claim a significant proportion of those as compensation costs for the purposes of meeting that 75% threshold, and therefore be able to have a significant portion of them recoverable. The one, I think, important caveat to just clarify here is that the degree to which your application is going to be structured in this way is going to be a partnership between you who are doing the application and your lender, who's the one who's going to submit it for you. So it's the same lender you used when you got your PPP. We have seen that, at least in the application process, there's been some differences in interpretation between one lender and another on what costs count, how to calculate different portions of the math. And we have decent reason to believe that that'll also be true when we go back 8 weeks later for forgiveness. And so I say that specifically because I can speak directly to what Accion is going to do for the loans that we do. I can make pretty largely right answers for what other lenders will do, particularly where the guidance is very clear. But just to be as transparent as we can, I'm not able to say with definitive detail exactly what each lender is going to do, because they do get to make their own judgments about how to interpret the rules where it's not crystal clear about that. Anyway, so sorry to make that longer than it needed to be, but it is an important caveat. Just keep in mind so that nobody is super surprised about that when you're dealing with your specific lender, that somehow, that on some cases on the margin, the interpretations may differ a little bit.
Great. I was in the process of expanding my business. I want to look into Accion loans. Can I apply for it now, or should I wait until July?
Well, first of all, excellent. Congratulations that you're in a position in which you're ready to expand. We want a lot more of that everywhere we can find it. I think the answer to your question is that we, I think, as early as middle of June, are going to then reopen our ability to take new applications for new non-emergency loans. So I say that specifically because if you're seeking to do expansion and you have already secured a Paycheck Protection Program loan, and you're seeking more capital after that for that expansion, then yes, mid-June is about the time when we'll be reopening and evaluating those loans, so that in early Q3 we can start doing those fundings. But to be clear, if you have not received a Paycheck Protection Program loan, you should apply for that today, particularly if you're in expansion mode and where you're going to have costs that are forgivable. So depending on your circumstance, either apply today or apply in, say, mid-June.
And now looking into your crystal ball, Brad, do you think there will be more grants that will be opened to small businesses in the future before the November election?
Do I think that? Yes. Can I prove that? No. Frankly, the reason why I think that is because even if Congress at the federal level continues to bicker into June, which I fully expect that they will, before passing any other substantive assistance to small businesses, I think the most likely case is that there'll be some additional assistance because the demand so exceeds the supply. And at the state and city levels, I think it's a tougher question because the budgets have to be balanced, unlike at the federal level, and therefore all of the capital that the state and city had originally has been fully deployed already, or at least is in the process of with current programs. And so therefore, I think the real answer is it's going to be federally driven, no question. But the federal government will either make a decision to provide direct assistance in the form of, I wouldn't say like direct grants, but rather forgivable loans, like, for example, another round of PPPs under different terms. I have confidence for if it is reauthorized for more dollars. Or if the federal government does provide state and local dollars in support of the budgets that need to be balanced, then it's plausible that one or both of the state and local government could decide to use a portion of those dollars as direct grant assistance for small businesses. So again, will that happen? Hard to say, but is it possible? Yes.
And we're actually going to do two more questions before we wrap up, and both of them are actually in relationship to unemployment, and we did get a couple other ones with that too. So the first question is, if you work a full-time job and you have a storefront and your storefront is closed due to COVID-19, can you apply for unemployment?
It's a good question. So let me say first that I do not consider myself to be an unemployment insurance expert. What I've dug into for our organization is to be smart about the interaction between unemployment insurance and other potential benefits for small business owners. And so, I guess, I mean, to be sort of a little bit too trite about it, can you apply for unemployment insurance? Of course you can, right? You can apply for anything you'd like. Whether you'd be able to secure that unemployment insurance from employment insurance benefit from the state, and whether you'd be at any risk of being called on that based on your specific circumstance, that's a tougher question to answer. And so I think it's highly unlikely that in the spirit of the way in which the state would interpret the unemployment insurance regulations, that if you have a full-time job, you'd be eligible for unemployment insurance, even if you previously had a storefront business that you were running at the same time that you had a full-time job otherwise. So I think the answer to that is yes, you can apply. Are you eligible under the spirit of the program? I don't think so. But I suppose I should stop there because I don't have the detailed expertise about what the implications would be if you applied, secured those funds, and then got asked about it later.
And that kind of leads to the last question, and you kind of answered it in your response to the previous one. As a sole proprietor, I did receive a PPP loan from my bank. Does this mean I am not eligible for unemployment through IDS or PUA?
So the way that these interactions are meant to work is that if you have a Paycheck Protection Program loan, that is meant to cover your compensation as a sole prop, and therefore you're not meant to be eligible for unemployment insurance. I say not meant to be, and again, you can feel the sort of mushiness in the language there, because there have been certain circumstances where we've worked with small business owners who have a very particular set of facts which lead us to believe that actually you could apply for unemployment insurance. The usual case that we've seen, though, more frequently is that small business owners are able to apply for PPP, secure those funds, use those funds for the purposes of covering compensation, and then once those funds have been expended, seek to get those funds forgiven. And then once that forgiveness has been received, then essentially that contractual relationship has ended with the federal government. And then if you're still out of work and can't reopen your business, then you can at that moment apply for unemployment insurance. And therefore you can do these things sequentially, quite clearly, in a way that I'm not sure that it's clear enough that you can do them concurrently. So that's what generally we've recommended people evaluate, because it is quite clear that those two things are okay if you do them not at the same time for the same purpose.
Right, so that concludes our Q&A session. Just some positive feedback and comments saying great insight. You guys are doing a great job. Congratulate you on the excellent level of communication you provide. And I definitely want to echo those comments, Brad. Thank you so much for joining our BACP webinar. It's been super insightful, helpful. If there are any questions that were unanswered, is there an email or website that people can go to submit?
Yes, Jackie, could you put into the chat, please, the help email address for Accion, which is staffed by our team, which we hold everybody accountable for a 24-hour turnaround in responses. And so I think that's the immediate answer to that question. So Jackie, thank you for doing that. There you go. Help at axionchicago.org. That's the very direct place where you will absolutely get service from us. Let me add just in closing that I always feel like when we have discussions like this, that there's so much more that we ideally would be able to communicate that we can't clearly enough. So just want to recognize that. And there's, first of all, enormously more work to do here to support small business owners that are struggling because of the circumstances that they have no control over and didn't have anything to do with. Mm-hmm. But we're going to keep doing the best we can. And I'm really grateful for the partnership we have with BACP, and just know that we're going to keep getting smarter and faster and more clear in how we can help people to get through this.
Absolutely. We thank you for your partnership too. Over the years, obviously, but even more so during this time, you guys have been absolutely amazing to work with. So thank you so much. And everyone, thank you again for joining us this morning. I put in the chat once again that this webinar will be posted on the BACP YouTube page. Just go to youtube.com and search for Chicago BACP. And with that, thank you so much again. And I hope everyone has a really good rest of your Friday. Thank you.
Thank you.